quiet for a couple minutes. Good morning. Is it okay, Susan? Okay. So we chanted this morning, rather than, because this is the last Sunday of the month. I'm just kind of saying this for the people that would view this. What do we call that? It's not, is it a video? Is it still a video? Yeah. That normally the last Sunday of the month at this temple is renewing the precepts, which is practice that goes back to the time of the historical Buddha. And in the time of the Buddha, when he was alive, the monks would come together twice a month on the new and full moon, and they would recite the precepts. The old monk, usually the oldest one, who had it memorized, because as we know, we were a oral tradition for a very long time. And so the oldest monk would recite the precepts, and he would recite them 3 times and ask if anybody had broken a precept. And the other old monks would monitor that monk to make sure that he hadn't made a mistake. And recently I've had some conversations with some folks talking about what happens within an oral tradition, that things start getting changed early on, and that it becomes more folklore and more stories. And the example that was used was like the fairy tales, the European fairy tales, that over time the stories were subtly changed. We certainly do that in the Zen tradition. In other words, if I was to tell a story to try to teach you something, to get a point across about conduct or perception or something like that, I'm totally free to change the story to make the point. And that's always been the way the tradition runs. And when I was young, I would read these little books on Zen. There weren't very many around at the time. And I was always kind of a little bit confused because sometimes the stories weren't exactly the same from time to time. And growing up in a Judeo-Christian tradition, as America is for the most part, Scripture always has to be exactly the same because, of course, it's perfect, right? So there, in the back of my mind, even though I wasn't a Christian, there was that idea that these anything religious should always be exactly the same. But another tradition besides the Zen tradition, big on stories and big on making the stories teach the lesson rather than worrying about them being absolutely the same each time, which is the Sufis. They use stories to teach with. And stories are very good because we have a concept within Buddhism which is almost impossible to talk about. And that concept is enlightenment. And we started today at our sutra class. We got introduced to the Platform Sutra, or the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, Wei Ning. And I read the first couple pages of the sutra and encouraged everyone to grab a book out of the library. And we have 5 or 6 different translations. And in the beginning, it says, it talks about knowing the self-nature. And sometimes we call it knowing true nature. Or we can simply say knowing who we are. I always laugh when I read about a 22-year-old movie star or a 22-year-old pop singer who went on retreat to discover who they are. They haven't lived long enough to be anybody, So it's to me it's a funny thing. But that's one way of talking about what's going on with this thing called enlightenment, understanding who we are. And but to talk about it is almost impossible. And what's even stranger is a bunch of people standing around talking about what they think enlightenment is, and they're not enlightened. And I don't know how you do that. It's kind of like talking music theory. Susan and I could talk music theory for sure. Steve and I could talk about the music we like, but I don't know if I could talk music theory with Steve. If I said to Steve, that song leaves you hanging because it has no cadence, Susan immediately knows what I mean. Steve would go, okay, I think I know what you mean. Okay? So how do we talk about something we have not experienced? How do we talk about enlightenment? And it's kind of ridiculous. But we can talk about becoming aware of something we didn't know. That experience. And I call it the aha experience. And people have them all the time. They're trying to solve a problem in their life, and usually they kind of move away from the problem, and then all of a sudden the answer appears. In Western society, we have a way we talk about this. We say, I'll sleep on it. If I say to you, so what are you going to do about that? That's a real problem. How are you going to solve that problem? And your reply is, gosh, I don't know. Well, you've got to do something. And then perhaps you say, well, let me sleep on it. I grew up in a household where people slept on things. And you wake up the next day and lo and behold, you have an answer. My first teacher, who was Japanese, when people would come, it didn't matter. You've heard, and the people here have heard me say this probably many times. He didn't teach Buddhism. Not as you would think of Buddhism. He didn't talk about the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path. He was a real anomaly, and unfortunately, he's also very underappreciated because he was simply a man of Zen. He certainly had his faults, as we all do, but when somebody would come to him and say, and they were usually life problems, because of course, back in those days, I used to joke when I had my first temple, I'd tell people if I was Oriental and old, everybody would think I knew something. Whether I did or not, they would assume I knew something. Well, now I'm old, but I can't make the Oriental thing happen. So I only trick some of the people into thinking I know something. The others, they go, okay, I don't know about him. I agree with some of his stuff, but I think he's really wrong about other stuff. Well, this whole thing of enlightenment is a tricky deal. It's like talking about a food that you've never eaten and trying to have a conversation about it. And you say to me, well, what's in this food? Because I've had some experience. And I say, well, it has noodles, and it has parsley, and it has Gouda cheese, whatever that is. Sounds good, doesn't it? And it has little slices of carrots. And I start describing this, and you start in your mind building an idea of what it is, but you still don't know what it tastes like. Because I could give all of that to you raw. I could give all of that to you cooked and cold. I could give all of that to you baked. But if I say to you, did you ever have a subject that you were studying at any point in your educational life? It could have been grade school, high school, could have been college, could have been graduate school. Did you ever have something that you just couldn't get it? You just simply could not figure out what was going on. I remember my second year of algebra in college. I bought a box of chalk, and I was out on my front porch in Long Beach. And that's the old, they call them craftsman-style houses. They had these big porches, concrete porches that you stepped up onto. And I was out there writing out formulas because I just couldn't get it. And I don't know that I ever did get it. But I remember going out there, and I felt like crying. I just couldn't come up with just couldn't get it into my head. And the teacher was the most horrible teacher in the whole world. He was way past his prime. He was on an extension. He was the department chair. And he would come in and he would start telling stories about his early life. And he would never talk about the algebra. And we'd go home with our book and try to figure out what we were supposed to know for the test. But other things have clicked. The concept of a cadence. The first time you get done playing a piece of music that lasts about 20 minutes, and you come to a cadence, and there's no doubt in your mind, in your body, in your soul, in anything, that's the end. Right, Susan? That's what the word means. The end. You return to the tonic. But the first time that jumps up in your mind, it's an aha. The first time you realize why you shouldn't do this activity or do that activity, it's an aha. Can you imagine a small child who's burned their hand on the stove? The second time they go to touch the stove and they realize they're going to burn their hand, momentarily they have an enlightenment. They have an aha. You start seeing the relationship between things. Enlightenment is about understanding who you are. And in understanding who you are, you see the relationship in the world. Doesn't mean you have all the answers. One of the mistakes that was made by early Buddhists and later Buddhists and Buddhists today is to think that the Buddha is omniscient. The Buddha did not know everything, and he never said he knew everything. He said he knew who he was. And he said it in the most peculiar way. He said, I am the Tathagata. What an interesting word. I remember one time we were doing a ceremony to make someone a Buddhist, and I had known this gal for 3 or 4 or 5 years. She'd been a student of mine, and I never knew that she had her tongue pierced. And I said, we did the ceremony, and she had to, we do the Kesa verse, and she had to say Tathagata, and she just about ripped that thing out of her tongue because it got caught on her teeth trying to say Tathagata. It means the thus come one. So what does that mean? The thus come one. I've arrived. Where did you arrive? At the self. Well, weren't you always there? Yes, you were always there. So what's the problem? You didn't know. It makes a lot more sense when you hear about someone going through midlife crisis. Men go through midlife. Men are hysterical when they go through midlife crisis. I feel so sorry for women when they go through midlife crisis because it's this kind of wrenching sort of thing they have to go through trying to figure out who they are. Okay? I mean, this is just my personal observation that it can be such a difficult thing. Not everybody goes through it, but a lot of people go through it. They look at themselves and they go, what have I done with my life? Where am I going to go now? Jane's shaking her head. Yes, she knows. Jane, for those who cannot see her, someday we have to line everybody up and take the camera and go, this is Steve, this is Susan, this is Jane, this is Rob, this is Mary. But it's a very difficult time because you essentially question your worth. Okay? Men, I don't think they do that. Men go out and buy funny clothes and try to be young again. I remember back when we lived in Long Beach, which was almost 40 years ago now, there was a couple guys I knew that were, they were 60 or something like that, or 50, and they went out and bought white shoes with white belts, and they wore all these funny shirts, and they were trying to be young again, and they thought it had something to do with the clothes, and I laughed at them, but I felt sorry for them, and most of the time they were doing just fine with their life. Everything's okay, but we get confused. We don't think everything's okay. We think things are supposed to be different than they are. And I love things like concepts of supposed to be. That means somebody determined what they were supposed to be, right? I mean, I don't think that's good dictionary language. Someone determined what the supposed to be is. That's probably better. But then that becomes an outside influence. Who are you supposed to be at this time? Exactly who you are. And if you say to me, I'm not happy, I go, well, then change it. I can't change it. Steve can't change it. Right? Nobody can change you're happy. But you can change it. You can look around and realize that the spot you're in at this moment is the very best spot you could be in. And you become the Tathagata. You become the Daskam one. You have arrived at this place. And you've arrived very well. And it doesn't matter what your health is. And it doesn't matter who respects you. And it doesn't matter what accomplishments you have. Gosh, I read about a couple of people recently. Movie stars. I have a new phone. I guess I ought to announce to the world, I have one of those phones that's a pocket computer. And for years I had a flip phone and everybody made fun of me. And I finally got this pocket computer thing. And I'm on it all the time. If I don't know what a word means, I can't find my dictionary, but I can look it up on that thing so quickly. And I looked up a couple, if I watch some television and I see somebody that's on the television, and I wonder who they are and what they did. So I can look them up on it, and it tells me about what they've done. And I looked at a couple of people. I got tears in my eyes. They had done so much great things. They'd helped so many people. They were on the boards of so many excellent organizations, besides being movie stars. And they're also not the movie stars that come out and make an announcement about how horrible our president is or how bad these people are. They're not those kind of movie stars. These are movie stars that are too busy helping people. And so I read about them and I truly, they touch my heart. I think, what great people they are. What extraordinary people they are. Because, ultimately they have a lot of free time. And they have a couple extra bucks. And they're doing some good work with that. Now, I could become depressed because I am who I am. Or I could accept that what I'm doing is okay. It doesn't have to be spectacular. When I die, are they going to write about me? Well, he established his temple in the desert. Big deal. Lots of people have established churches and temples. So I don't know what they'll write, but they won't have a long list of organizations because nobody wants me to be on their board. And I think they're very smart because they don't want me to be on their board. But I could do a little more than I'm doing. And I looked at that and I thought, well, okay. Once I get done with this house down here that we're remodeling for the temple, then I probably should go out and do a little more than I'm doing. Right? You nod your head like this, yes. Yep, you can get off your duff and go out and do a little bit more than you do. I do a couple things for other people, but they're not even worth mentioning. But maybe I could do a little bit more, not necessarily mention them. So we chanted this morning. We have a liturgy we do of renewing the precepts, and we did something different because we ended the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is a wonderful sutra because the whole emphasis of the Lotus Sutra is that you are all Buddha. But what I mean by that is you all have the Buddha nature. You all have the capacity to become awakened. Now, I literally mean you're all Buddha also. 40 years ago, I wouldn't have said that because 40 years ago, science had not come to the conclusion that we all are really connected. Buddha had. Buddha said it, but I kind of doubted him, And that was okay because the Buddha said, you can doubt me. He said, no matter what I've said, if you haven't made it real for yourself, you don't have to believe it. Just because you respect me, you don't have to believe it. I have a friend who would say, that's bad science. Just because you respect someone, they got a PhD, so now they tell you something, so you believe it even though it doesn't make any sense. No. The Buddha said, examine it for yourself. Make it real for yourself. So this idea that we're all connected, we're all related. I recently on my phone, this is me bird walking again, but I thought, how am I ever going to work that? And I didn't bring it with me. I was looking up Billy Graham. Don't ask me why I was looking up Billy Graham, but I looked up Billy Graham. Billy Graham was a nice guy. He was a highly admired guy, matter of fact. He was like, one of the most admired people in the 20th century. And I read this on there, like the magazines have a thing, who do you admire? And then Billy Graham was not a bigot. He grew up in South Carolina. And Billy Graham, in the 50s, at one of his big tent revivals, because that's what he did, he did the big revival meetings. He went out to the people, and let me back up a little bit. In South Carolina, they had, which I believe is where he was at. He might have been in Mississippi. They put up ropes so the black people could sit in this area, and the white people could sit in the white area. And Billy Graham, someone get choked up. He went out and he knocked down the ropes. And he told them to leave the ropes on the floor. And they went to put the ropes back up because this is segregated South. And he said, if you put the ropes back up, I leave. I will not be here for this revival meeting. So they left the ropes down, and he got up and he gave a sermon, which I've got to write down. I ought to put it on a piece of wood and carve it out and stuff, because it was a wonderful what he said. And this is a Christian guy. And he said, we are driven by our pride. We have justified the way we treat other people through pride. And he went on to say that nowhere in the Bible, and I know nothing about the Bible. I know sutras, but I don't know the Bible. He said nowhere in the Bible does it justify treating people differently because they're a different color or a different religion. And he says, your pride is going to be your downfall. If you continue to have pride in the fact that you're white, it's going to follow you all the way to hell. And I was very moved by reading that. He always came across as a nice guy, Billy Graham did. And I read that and I thought he really was a nice guy. But some of his life was being nice to people. Today we chanted the Sutra for Avalokiteshvara, which we know by a much easier name to say, which is Kuan Yin, Chinese, or Quanum, Quanziam in Vietnamese. And in that sutra, it sounded very, very superstitious. It says, if something terrible is going to happen to you, if you just think on Kuan Yin, everything will be okay. It said if you're going to be bitten by a scorpion or a snake, if you think about Kuan Yin, be okay. If you're on a boat and it's getting ready to sink into the ocean, and if you call out the name of Kuan Yin, you'll be okay. And it goes on and on like that. And it sounds very old-fashioned superstition. So who is Kuan Yin? Kuan Yin is the embodiment of compassion. Kuan Yin is the embodiment of kindness. Kuan Yin is the embodiment of caring about someone else more than you care about yourself. So if you become afraid and you think about everybody else, you stop being fearful. And I think of firemen. How could you ever be a fireman if you're always worried about being burned? And we know that even though our policemen suffer great tragedies, and they have done that in the area that we live in here recently, we've had a lot of policemen just shot, just killed for no reason. But nationally, forever, more firemen die in the line of duty than policemen every year. And how could they ever do their job if they thought always about themselves? They couldn't get it done. And that's who Kuan Yin is. So when you're in a dangerous situation, if you think of somebody else, you stop worrying about yourself. If you move through your life and you think of somebody else, you stop worrying about yourself. It's very hard to get depressed about what you've done in your life if you're too busy taking care of other people. And that's what the Lotus Sutra teaches. That's what it's all about, is taking care of each other. It's not about worrying about whether I've done enough things to qualify to be a good guy, or I've done enough things to qualify to be important. Enlightenment is not about being important. Enlightenment is about knowing who you are. And when you know who you are, you know who everybody else is, and everything's okay.